Welcome everyone to another episode of the Evokecast. Tonight I have a really interesting story for everyone to see. We're going to have a slideshow put on by one of our coaches, Luke Nelson, who also I have been coaching Luke now for I'm thinking at least about 6 years, right, Luke?
Yeah.
Maybe more. Luke's someone I certainly consider a good friend. He was recently given the opportunity, and I think there'll be a little story behind this, to travel to Bhutan to compete in the Snowman race. Now, if you don't know where Bhutan is and you've never heard of the Snowman race, you're probably not alone. But by the end of this, I suspect you're going to be wanting to get your visa and head there yourself. The pictures I've seen are just drop dead gorgeous, and I think it's quite a fascinating story. So thanks a lot, Luke, for coming on and sharing this with everyone.
Yeah, so happy to be here and happy to be able to share about the Snowman race. It was an incredible experience. So I hope people enjoy hearing a bit more about it.
Yeah, well, let's dive in. I know you've got some really cool stories, and certainly the pictures are spectacular. So let's roll. And if I come up with any questions, I will stop you and ask those questions. I'm sure that I'll try to ask some of the same kind of questions I expect that the audience might have.
Awesome. That sounds great. So for those of you in audio land, you're probably going to want to check this out on YouTube because there's going to be a lot of reference to the photos on the screen. But I'll try to keep the storytelling good enough that it's good in your headphones alone. So any good adventure, I think, starts at your front door with some expedition duffel bags packed. And so I just have a quick photo of that, heading to this race in Bhutan requires a lot of travel. I live in Idaho. Bhutan is essentially on exactly the other side of the planet. And so I loaded up my bags, tossed them in the back of my truck, met a friend, and we carpooled down to Salt Lake City, Utah, and started our planes, trains, and automobiles trip across the planet. About partway through our flights, I've got a photo here of Nate Bender from Missoula, Montana, and Gabe Joyez from Lander, Wyoming. We were part of the international contingent for the Snowman race. The Snowman race invited 20 international runners from all over the planet, those who had extensive resumes with mountain running, self-supported mountain running, being in the mountains, high mountains in a lot of instances, and doing hard things. So these two friends of mine also got spots in the race, and we were fortunate enough to travel and experience interesting things like self-cleaning robots in Korea during our layover. Eventually, our flights, 31 hours after leaving Salt Lake City, landed us in Bangkok, Thailand, 11-hour time difference. We slept little. And so what we would normally do, we went for an early morning run and played a bit of Frogger, the streets of Bangkok. It's pretty sporty going from running all alone in the mountains of Idaho to trying to survive the city streets of Bangkok, Thailand. Plus the humidity was pretty wild, and that was kind of our intro to meeting up with some of the other team as we continued with our travels. So layover in Thailand for a day, and then off to Bhutan. So an interesting thing on the flight from Bangkok to Paro, Bhutan, we hopped on the plane. All 20 international athletes had met in Thailand. We were flying on Druk Air, which is the government's airline. And we hop on, and the airline magazine centerfold story was about the Snowman race, which was pretty wild. This race hadn't even happened yet. But this airplane was full of all of us international runners. And the person sitting behind me, Megan Hicks from Colorado, snapped this photo of me explaining to this businessman from Singapore about the race that we were coming to do, which was pretty cool. And with that, I want to give a little bit more background about the Snowman race itself. So
was this the first time that this race had been held?
Yes. So the race was the idea of His Majesty, the King of Bhutan, for his 40th birthday. He wanted to host an endurance event in the country to raise awareness about climate change, which is a pretty interesting birthday wish for anyone, let alone a king of a country. This was in 2019. So we got together a group of people to help him, US-based race director Luis Escobar, their production team, and then several committees of various government officials from Bhutan, and they started working on putting this together. And they hatched the idea of doing a stage race across the Bhutanese Himalaya of roughly 130 miles, 5 days with 4 night halts. So you would run for the day, stay the night, run for the next day. It would be semi self-sufficient. So we would be required to carry our own sleeping bags, all of our clothing, our food for the day. And when we would get to the camp at night, we would have access to a tent, a pad, and a warm dinner and breakfast. So that puts a bunch of logistics that we'll go over here in a few minutes about what we had to carry. And the race course, for ultra runners out there, you think 130 miles over 5 days, pretty manageable. But you start looking at the real numbers of this, and the lowest elevation of the race would be starting at 11,000 feet. We would be going up to just shy of 18,000 feet. Cumulative gain over the 135 miles was 38,000 feet of ascent, and the same of descent. And we were going to be carrying kind of heavy packs. So those pieces you'll see as I give a little bit more about the race itself, turned out to make it a pretty dang hard run. So I was explaining this to this businessman from Singapore. He was super interested, and some of my fellow colleagues on the plane ended up gathering a whole crowd of people talking about it, because in Bhutan they'd been talking about this for months, about this big race that was coming. This is the contingent. So you'll see more than 20 runners here. Kind of in the upper right corner of the picture, there's 9 individuals in traditional Bhutanese dress. These are the Bhutanese runners that were selected over a pretty rigorous period. They had several selection races, and there were 9 runners selected to represent Bhutan, 5 men and 4 women, and then a couple of alternates that were also here in the picture. And from the minute that we arrived in the country and received a pretty incredible greeting from the Snowman race officials, they became part of the group. So all of the international athletes and the national athletes, we would be working together from that point until we flew home, several weeks later. I'll give a little bit of background about a few of those runners here shortly, but the long story short is they are legit top tier athletes. The second place overall finisher of the Snowman race is the Bhutanese marathon record holder. He's run a 2:31, won some Asian championships. Great runners. So this is the group, this is our arrival. And immediately we were immersed in 2 very important things. One, a cultural experience of Bhutan. So they started to introduce us to some of the incredible Bhutanese culture. This was full day in the country. Second day after arriving, we went to a place called the Tiger's Nest Monastery. This is built into the middle of a 500-foot cliff. It's an active monastery, and we got to visit and have an experience that I don't think all tourists get to, where we were invited in and had a mindfulness session with the monk in charge. He offered us some advice, and also on the way out of this mindfulness session, I thanked him, and he handed me a bundle of prayer flags that he had blessed and asked that I place them on the course for the safety of the participants. And so I was given this task to carry some prayer flags, and he recommended that I place it on the high point of the course. And he'd prayed over these, worried about these runners that were going to go through this event up in the high mountains of Bhutan. That evening, so we're day 2 in the country, we were required to drop off our drop bags. So each runner was allowed 1 drop bag per night halt. It had to be under 4 kilograms, and it had to be in a waterproof bag, and you had no intention of receiving the contents after the race. You could use it when you arrived at the night halt. And the reason that is 2 of the night halt stations would take 6 days each direction on horse for the group to get in and get out. And so they wouldn't be out of the night halt stations by the time we left the country. And I snapped this photo because I found it to be such a fascinating example of the different levels of experience and comfort of the runners, and the different sizes of drop bags. You'll see some very small, some in burlap bags because these would be hauled on horses. Someone had expedition experience there. Others in river dry bags. I didn't get all of the drop bags, but later some would show up in like gallon Ziploc bags. I was fascinated by what people thought they would need or wouldn't need being out there. And I certainly went on the edge of being a little over prepared with what I packed. And then those drop bags were gone. We wouldn't see them until we got to the night haul stations about 10 days later. The next morning, we got out for a little shakeout run in the capital of Bhutan, Thimphu. This was interesting. Typically, you'd think you could get out for a run in the morning, no big deal. We had to run in a group because there was some concern about the local dog population not being interested in us running through their territory early in the morning. So we would run in a large group each morning, which was great team building for us to get to know runners from here. There's runners from Japan, the US, Switzerland, and so all over the world. And we got to quickly become friends with these athletes from all over. We continued our kind of tourist activities, visited the giant Buddha in the capital of Bhutan. There we were also greeted by the second in charge monk for the country of Bhutan, where he gave us each an individual blessing of safety and strength for the journey ahead, which was a pretty cool experience. And then that night we had the beginning of the second part of our education. So we were getting these cultural experiences. And then the other part, we were being educated on climate change and its impacts in Bhutan. This gentleman here is the former prime minister of Bhutan. Bhutan is a constitutional monarchy, quite like the UK, where they have a king or queen, and then they have an elected government. And this gentleman was the former prime minister. He spent a good bit of time explaining to us the challenges that Bhutan was facing with climate change and educating us on their efforts, as they are a carbon negative country. They use or sequester more carbon than they produce, and give us some specific challenges or tasks of what we should keep an eye out for when we were out in the mountains. And again, this is where the magic starts to happen with this race. When are you invited to a country by a king and then educated by the top government officials? And this happened over and over again. The next morning, we spent time in the headquarters of the military. For those US listeners, that would be the equivalent of going to the Pentagon. We were invited into a command room where we were given a brief about the race, about the safety plan, and all of the incredible logistics that the government of Bhutan was supporting for this race. Which included branches of the military, their National Weather Service, their health and human services, so their medical groups, and in all, it ended up several hundred volunteers that would be supporting us and keeping us safe as we were wandering ourselves out through the Himalaya. After a few days, we eventually then packed up buses, and as you would in a remote mountainous country, there was a lot of travel left ahead. So we packed all our bags on the top of these 3 buses and then spent 9 hours driving north to the start area of the race, a place called Gaza. When we arrived in Gaza, it was after, we drove past some incredible fortresses. Each, I guess, county or state of Bhutan has a fortress where the government and monastic leaders gather. This was one of the more incredible ones that we went past along that drive. We also played a wicked game of bus Uno that lasted for several hours. We eventually got to Gaza late that night and were greeted by the school children under pouring rain, where they performed a welcome dance for us, greeting us to their community and giving us kind of a warm welcome. Next morning, we got out for the first of kind of an eye-opening shakeout run. So pictured here is the female Bhutanese contingent out front of this group of runners, and then a couple of the other Bhutanese men on the side. This run was our first really at altitude. We were at 10,000 feet. And And the amazing thing is this isn't a video, but these runners were singing traditional Bhutanese songs while we were running up this road. The international runners were not singing. We were barely hanging on as it became clear that their acclimatization was far superior to ours.
And it wasn't just that you didn't know the words, right?
Yeah, no, if I knew the words, I would have sang if I could have, but there wasn't enough air. And we would get a shakeout run the next 3 mornings with the group up out of this hot springs that we were staying at. The hot springs, unfortunately, the year before had been destroyed by a glacier lake outburst flood, which is an event that's related to climate change. Rapidly receding glaciers form a lake with a fragile barrier or boundary that holds a massive amount of water. And these are known to break and then create devastating floods downstream. And this hot springs resort had been essentially destroyed. The hot springs washed away, the river channel changed. And this was, I think they said 60K downstream from where the flood started. In that particular event, no one died, but in similar events recently, there have been deaths because of these glacial lake outburst floods. There in Gaza, we would do our gear checks. This is someone that I became a friend with. This is Waturo from Tokyo, Japan, doing his gear check. This was another thing that was also very fascinating for me. Runners with a lot of experience bringing widely varying kits of what people thought they would need in addition to the required equipment. I'll show my required equipment here in just a minute. That afternoon, we were invited to the fortress of Gaza, Gazazong, and the abbot, the head monk of the monastery there, invited us in. And this is a really unique photo. It was taken by one of his monks. You normally are not allowed cameras in these spaces. They're very sacred spaces. In the background of that photo, there's these things in bags. They're nitrogen sealed saddles from the 600s. 4 and 600. They're really, really old. And he explained to us the importance of their preservation of culture over time. I guess those were about to be shipped off to a famous museum. Also, some of the most powerful teachings that I've ever experienced directly from a Buddhist leader, where he challenged all of us runners to open our hearts to the mountains, the rivers, and the trees as we traveled through this remote environment, and listen to the stories they would have for us and to gather strength from them. It carried a pretty significant weight that I'll tie back into in a story when we were out running. So we had this incredible experience at the monastery. This is 2 days before the race start. The next day, I got the opportunity to give some crash course GPS instruction. We were given GPX routes, required to have an app on our phones to navigate with. Some of the Bhutanese runners during gear check, it was discovered that they didn't really know how to use this. So that next morning, we spent several hours. We built a course around the hot springs. We taught them how to use it. Then we went about practicing. And man, it was fun. Really cool to share a skill set with these very gifted athletes with something that they just hadn't been exposed to. And it would turn out that they would need pretty significantly later on in the race. That evening, we spent some time with the chairman of the Snowman race committee. This is at the site of the hot springs. Behind where we're standing is where the hot springs was once. And we had kind of a somber discussion about the reality of climate change and its impacts on Bhutan. And on developing nations, marginalized communities, and how serious this situation really is for us. And again, challenged to watch and learn while we were running about what we could see directly related to climate change. Okay, let's talk about kit for a minute. So this is a picture of my kit laid out. Here I have almost all that is shown is required. So we're required to carry a sleeping bag. They recommended that we carry a sleeping bag at a minimum of a 0 degree rating. because that's what the trekking groups generally use, is either a 0 or a -20-degree sleeping bag. I opted for a little bit lighter sleeping bag and a sleep system, so carried a down jacket and down pants, which were not required, but I felt that they were a pretty useful thing to have up in the high mountains because I could wear them as well. We had to have a couple of top layers for insulation, rain jacket, rain pants, capacity to carry 2 liters of water. You had to have a first aid kit, 2 working headlamps, sunglasses, bivy sack, gloves, and I think poles were recommended. So that's just my kit. I also added, a battery charger was also required. I also added just a couple of additional layers that I know work really well for me, and some down socks to wander around in camp once we got there. They took our portraits. So this is us, 12-ish hours before the race. This ultimate race for climate action that they'd put together. Those photos were a little out of order. So that nutrition wise, this was my plan for the day, where each day looked about the same. It was about 3,000 calories. The wild thing going into this is I didn't know how long each day would take. They were between 25 and 30 miles a day, lots of elevation gain, high altitude. And so I kind of overshot what I thought I would need for calories. And you'll see that I had a mix of GU energy products, which are kind of the science fuel, and then junk food. Because it turns out that when I'm at high altitude, I can tolerate junk food pretty well. So I had some Twix and gummy bears and peanut butter M&Ms, which wildly, that little bag of M&Ms is like 370 calories. It might be the most dense per gram per calorie food that exists on the planet. So more or less, that would be what each day's food would look like. And then the meals on each end would be more traditional Bhutanese food, which would be a variation of a dal, which you would have in Nepal, a rice dish, a lot of spice, and that would be for breakfast and for dinner. They would look very similar. Morning of the race, we woke up to pouring rain at 10,000 feet and went back up to Gazazong, which is the fortress that we'd visited a few days before. And we're greeted to this site. And this is a photo, it captures only a part of this, but this is a room full of young monks. These monks had been reciting prayers for 24 hours. And those prayers were on our behalf, for our safety, for our strength, for us to have good, just a good experience. And to walk up to this and be greeted by this concern, this level of concern by the people of Bhutan, both from the religious front, from the government front, the communities, they were all kind of worried about what we were going to try to do. The 5 days that we would spend on the trail is typically covered during the Snowman trek in 18 days, I believe is what it is. A much, much longer period of time. So we had this incredible welcome. There was a little bit more ceremony, another blessing that was given, butter lamp lighting, and then we were on our way. So let's talk nitty gritty about stage one. Stage one was 26 miles. It would go from 11,000 feet to camp was at 16,200 feet. So if you start looking at how that works out, that's a lot of climbing for the day, even just going A to B. The first about 10K was on a dirt road. The dirt road is more what I would consider a Jeep path. It wasn't something you could take a passenger car on. You would need a high clearance 4-wheel drive. And we were following along a river basin, and thankfully the clouds broke and it started to give us some blue sky, which is the first time since we had arrived at Gaza a few days before that we'd seen the sun. We gradually encountered this. So once we ended the road, we got to trail, and this trail is primarily a highway for moving goods. And those goods are not moved by vehicle, they're moved by horses and yak. It had been raining for the whole monsoon season. We were at the end of the monsoon. And so we would run for on and off for the next 5 days in ankle to knee deep mud in a lot of places. This is one of the horsepackers coming out. This time of year, a lot of the Highlanders start descending out of the high mountains and coming down. And so we were running into a lot of traffic coming our way. I spent a fair amount of time running this day with Taku from Japan, another incredible one of the international athletes. We just giggled our way through how ridiculous this footing was. You can imagine, though, it wasn't fast, right? We were moving as quickly as we could and efficiently as we could, but running in that deep of mud is just, it's full body experience. Eventually, I would work my way up to camp. In that time, it was just shy of 10,000 feet of climbing for the day, several miles above 16,000 feet before we arrived at camp. And this is the backdrop. So 16,200 feet and huge mountains above us. So we were in it. That day, as far as the race itself goes, I finished 7th. All 5 Bhutanese runners were ahead of me, and then Gabe Joyas, my friend from Lander, was about 8 minutes ahead of me. The first Bhutanese runner was 2 hours faster. It became really clear that they were going to play at a different level than we were going to. Part of it, I was taking a lot of photos, but another major part of it is the reality of moving fast above 16,000 feet is really hard when you live at 4. Speaking of those Bhutanese runners, 3 of them are members of the Royal Bhutanese Army, and they're commandos, and their job is to patrol the border between Bhutan and China or Tibet. So they are at 16 to 20,000 feet patrolling this border, making sure there aren't shenanigans from China. So they spend a lot of time at altitude, and these dudes are fit, so strong. About 10 minutes after I came into camp, Karma Youngdon, who's a yak herder, was the first female runner to come in. She was right on my heels as the 8th runner coming in for the day. And all 4 of the Bhutanese women can turn out to be very strong contenders throughout the whole race as well. This is when reality started to set in for the international runners. We had runners arriving much slower than they had anticipated. The altitude was having a much bigger impact on them. And we would eventually lose 6 runners that day that would not continue on to the next day due to altitude. So 6 of 20 international runners succumbed to altitude related maladies and chose not to continue. I would put a caveat on that is the next day would be quite deep into the mountains. And they told us that if you did have to drop there, helicopter rescue would be unlikely, and you would have to come out with the camp group, which would be after our flights left. So there was some motivation to maybe not push the limit too much, which I think was smart, because if you were suffering from altitude that early on, it was only going to get tougher. So we had some delicious spicy curry underneath those high peaks that night. Brian Powell, the camp manager that night, took this photo of our tents under a full view of the peaks. And then we woke the next morning to really, really cold. It was about 15 degrees when we woke up that morning. We were at 16.2, and immediately we would climb out of camp to just over 17,000 feet to the first high path before we would descend into the next valley. So this is that next morning. Stellar views of the Bhutanese Himalaya, and just kind of the tip of the iceberg of what we would be running through. So if you're looking at the photos, what you're looking towards is camp, and just before the pass, and then flipping on the other side, this is over the pass looking to where we were headed. That's a 4,000 foot descent to that river. And that's where we were going. So from 17 back down to 13, and then we'd go down the river basin for another several thousand vertical feet of descending before going back over a 16,000 foot pass, and then to 14,000 for camp that next day. When this day, Gabe, Joyas, and I actually ran together the whole day, and turns out we'd run the whole race and the rest of the race together. We were moving well together. It made sense to stick together once we got way out there, and it gave us some company. But once we would get low every time, we would get back into that mud, and we'd be back and forth into deep mud and then up into the high altitude, rocky terrain. Waturo caught us. He would be back and forth with the 3 of us. The 3 of us would go back and forth throughout the whole race, but a little view of mud transitioning to rock steps as we were climbing back out of that river basin the next day. Another incredible thing that would happen. This is really remote in the mountains, right? We're 35 miles from the nearest road, and we would come into these small communities, and they would be out and they would have tea and mango juice and cookies. And it wasn't an aid station, it wasn't officially sanctioned. They just knew that we'd be coming through, and so they'd be there to greet us. And it turns out that these three young ladies actually waited all day for all of the runners to come through, and were serving hot tea and cookies to all of us. So we took a moment to snap a picture. The Bhutanese runners were well ahead of us, so we were out of that mix of the race. But we enjoyed some tea and cookies with them before climbing over the next 16,000-foot path, which would be the kind of second high point of this day. These are incredible high passes, really rocky technical running. You can see the footing there. It's tough. Gabe and I would say that there were no easy miles in the Snowman race. You couldn't find your stride. You couldn't click it into a fast pace. It was kind of mountain grinding the whole time. As we crossed over this pass, we'd look into what's a very famous valley in Bhutan called the Lunana Valley. There's a great documentary film there of some school children called The Yak in the Classroom. But we would cross this 16,000-foot pass and then drop about 2,000 feet into that valley, where there are some relatively large communities. And, several hundred people would live in these high communities at over 14,000 feet. We finished the stage in about 8 hours. You can see I'm feeling it a little bit there. We've been greeted by the school children. Every time we go through a community where the school children would run out of the classroom and they'd cheer for us, and they had flags from the different countries. But here we were at camp. Crew gathered together. We would eat a family-style dinner every night, which was really fun. Tell kind of the stories of the day. Get to know the Bhutanese runners a little bit more, as well as just sharing that common experience of fueling in the mountains. This night was really special. We were invited to a campfire program outside of the cook tents by the school children, and they sang songs and they danced for quite a long time, and shared stories about their community. Including some fairly sombering stories about one of those Gloff events, those glacier lake outburst floods that several years prior had killed 40 people when the flood burst at 11 p.m. at night and flooded the valley and destroyed a bunch of homes. The storyteller, the person sharing that message with us, did tell us that where our tents were set up was one of the areas under the water. So it made for maybe a little bit not as restful sleep that night. So back to the grind. Next day, day 3 of the Snowman race we knew going into it was going to be the hardest. It was the longest. It was about a 50K day. We would go up to just shy 18,000 feet. We would spend a lot of time really high. Turns out Gabe and I, who finished the day in 12 hours, spent about 4 hours, about 4 to 5 hours above 16.5 and about 6 hours above 16,000 feet. I'll show some pictures of that really high basin here shortly, but you can see another cold start. Group of runners had whittled down. We lost 2 more overnight, succumbed to altitude illness, both international runners. So now the group was down 8, so 12 international runners, 9 Bhutanese runners. But this valley was something else. So this is running up the Lunana Valley. In the background there is the tallest unclimbed peak in the world, a little over 24,000 feet. And it probably will never be climbed. Bhutan considers their mountain summits as sacred. They don't allow climbing above 6,000 meters on peaks. And that's probably not going to see a summit ever, which is pretty amazing. And I can see your mountaineer eyes looking for lines there, Scott.
Oh, it's so spectacular. My gosh.
Yeah. And we would run up this valley it was about 8 miles up the valley before we really started to climb. There were yaks there. I mean, this is quintessential Himalaya to me. School children out early in the morning with this just huge massif in the background. It was hard to keep running. What you wanted to do is stop and just soak it in. And we did a little bit of that. There was a gentleman just prior to these school children who had come out and had chopped apples and had fresh apples in a basket that he was handing out to us. And later on, there was someone sharing tea, and well, we would stop and enjoy it, and instead of worrying about having a fast time, we would experience that humanity and the caring of those people wanting to share with us.
And these little kids are sort of spaced out here with, is that some sort of like, are they waving you on, or there's little posters they're carrying
Yeah,
and
that
welcome
yep,
you and
yep.
encourage
They were
you?
they were they were encouraging us both in English and in Bhutanese. Uh, it, and they were so excited to be out there. I'm sure they were excited to not be in the classroom for the day, but they were so excited. And this experience here probably went on for about a mile and a half. It was several classes worth of kids spaced out, and they would kind of be huddled up until they'd see us coming, and then they'd spread out to their perfect distance and cheer for us. Um, and it's hard not to be really motivated to do good when you have these young children out there just making you feel like you're some kind of celebrity or hero or something.
This
Um,
doesn't look like there's a lot of arable land here, Luke. Or are they growing roots, like root vegetables and barley? I know that that's kind of common in a lot of these high Himalayan valleys. But what did you see any crops? Of course, it was
Kind of end
let's
of the
see, we're
season.
end of the season. But were there
Yeah,
some fields that you could tell had been tilled?
there were some small fields, and they looked like they would be, and they had told us that like tubers, potatoes, things like that would grow okay there. A little bit lower down the kind of the low end of the valley, there were some apple orchards that we went through, um, and there is a lot of kind of commerce of them trading their produce to the lower communities, and the lower communities bringing up rice and things like that to them. But uh, when we were coming down off that 16,000-foot peak pass into Lunana, we went kind of through the backs of several homes, and there were lots of small gardens. Some had corn that were ready to go, but they looked like it was very much kind of on a house by house basis, as opposed to larger, maybe community based agriculture. Um, but not, I would say, not an easy place to scratch out an existence.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow. Yes.
yeah,
Looks, looks, reminds me, I mean, although it even actually has a little more vegetation than a lot of Pakistan does, but yeah, these people are hardy folks
they're
living in a
tough.
place like that.
Yeah, yeah, very, very tough. Um, so next photo here, we've come around the corner at the top of Lunana Valley, and now we're going to start climbing. So I believe Gabe, he's ahead of me here, about 15,000 feet. Mountains in the far background. We would cross right at the foot of those, and then head left to continue upwards. The grade here was not really steep. At low altitude, this would be a great place to run. But at the altitudes we were at, I describe it as just the air governor. There wasn't enough air to go any faster. And as it progressed, I have some videos that I've shared over on my Instagram page, but we would have to stop to eat because you couldn't chew and breathe and eat at the same time like you normally can at lower elevations. You just had to stop because there just wasn't enough air. And later we'd have to stop just to talk, because talking and moving and walking just wasn't happening at the same time. And there was a lot of hiking here. Running just wasn't a movement that there was a lot of happening. Um, this was me taking a brief moment to contemplate my life choices. I'd started to lose my appetite a little. We were 16.4, 16.5, somewhere there. I was still trying to force down food, and Gabe caught a moment of weakness of the food trying to force its way back out. um, this is amazing. So just over 17,000 feet, we came across a group of the military. They were a checkpoint for us. That we weren't told this checkpoint was going to be out there. They were there with a sat phone, phoning in our numbers back to the headquarters. The guy sitting on the ground was really sick with altitude sickness. He was not thrilled to be there. But the other two guys were pretty excited to greet us and keep tabs on us. We would encounter throughout the rest of this day, I think 6 more small military patrols that were out just to make sure we got through okay, which was pretty awesome.
They weren't there to make sure you weren't cutting the course or something.
I think we could have tried to cut anything. They wouldn't have cared as long as we kept moving and didn't stay with them. This is me just shy 18,000 feet, hanging the prayer flags that I was given at the Tiger's Nest. Uh, I think a combination of the stripping of ego that happens with long endurance events, plus a little bit of high altitude, this ended up being a really emotional experience for me. Um, a gesture of solidarity with my fellow runners, thinking of them and their safety, carrying out this task that the monk had given me. It was quite powerful, and you can casually see the military person there behind us, just holding the radio, and that guy hung out there all day and then followed the last runners into camp. Um, but just a beautiful place to be. Some high glaciated lakes. Um, Gabe and I just soaking it all in for a few minutes up there. I think we were 8 feet below 18,000 feet. So it's 17,990 something. Still big peaks behind us. I'm smiling there, but I'm not feeling awesome. Neither one of us had been moving very well or eating very well. And we still had a long ways to go. We had about a 5,000 foot descent, or 5,000 feet of descending with some intermixed climbing to get to camp. I took one more photo, or Gabe took one more photo. This is us just coming off the toe of a big glacier. And then we would descend this moraine for 6 miles, now empty of the glacier. And they explained to us that the glacier had receded about 3 miles in the last couple of years. So a significant amount of recession of this glacier. But moving through glacial moraine is wicked hard. It's basically running through a scree field. We were still at high altitude. We would only get down to 15.5. That's where the next camp would be. But we had all this undulating, like drop through the glacier and up onto the edge of it, or the moraine, and up on the edge, and up and down, up and down. There was also a little bit of a snafu that happened where this camp had been moved. When they arrived, when the group horse packed in, where they had intended on putting the camp at the time was not suitable. It was flooded. And so they moved downriver away from us about 3 more miles. That wasn't really clearly communicated to us. And so when we arrived where the camp was supposed to be, we started having these doubts of, we're tired, we're not thinking well, did we miss it? We carry on for an hour and we still didn't find it. Granted, we were moving at like 30 minutes per mile kind of pace. But Gabe and I actually at one moment decided that we just would have to move until we ran out of energy. We'd sleep for the night and then get up and start the next day because we had our sleeping bags and bivy sacks. Fortunately, we did eventually get to camp at 12 hours into our day.
Ooh. And now I have a question with these trails. These are obviously not recreational trails. But at these elevations, I mean, are there these summer pasture lands, do you think, for animals? Is that why there's as well traveled? I mean, this is what you wouldn't qualify as a U.S. Forest Service type trail, but I mean, it is obviously passed by people. So I was just wondering if you think that's what they're there for, transit and for herding and that sort of thing.
Yeah, primarily transit goods from these high mountain communities to the other high mountain communities. There's also a fair amount of yak herding that occurs up in these high basins. I didn't include the picture here, but just below the pass on the other side, we went through a herd of 3 or 4 yaks, just living their best life there at 18,000 feet. And the next day we would go through a herd of probably 100 yaks that they were working on moving out of the mountains. But primarily it's from moving horse path or yak path to move goods from one community to another. So this is the next morning, the aftermath. So we had our huge day. And when we got to camp that night on night 3, we were overhearing radio traffic that runners were in trouble. They needed assistance and they were moving some of the military personnel around. We sat down with the camp manager of that night and we're thinking, man, like, do we have to go out and help with the rescue? And so it was pretty fitful rest what we did get. Plus we were just wrecked from this huge day up at high altitude. There were some giggles the next morning of what it felt like just to be like hit by a train. And then we had to get up and run again. But because we had done extra mileage on day 3, day 4 was a little bit shorter. It would be our shortest day of 17 miles, but it had 8,000 feet of descent and 8,000 feet of ascent in 18 miles. Big climb initially, huge drop down to this beautiful river basin, and then climb back up over a pass to camp. This morning was really cool. When they started, the Bhutanese runners kind of just sat back, and Gabe and I led the run for about an hour. We kind of just chit chatted, everybody moved together. The Bhutanese runners had 3 or 4 hours on us at this point overall. We weren't catching them in 2 days, and so they enjoyed kind of the community aspect of running together for a little while. They eventually would then drop us. This is looking back. We had come around the corner up this valley, up this pass. This was one of 2 16,000 foot passes we would go over, or a little over 16.5. So 16.5, and then we would drop to this really deep river basin. A little bit hard to tell in the photo because the shadow. We started to get into some of the lower elevations once we dropped so far, back into the mud, thick forest. And this is not a part of Bhutan that's heavily traveled. And you could feel that. The trail was a little bit rougher. We saw no one at all this day out there, except for.
Have to confess, Luke, I don't actually see the trail.
It's obvious, right? Yeah, it goes just straight down the middle of that photo. And at this point, we are going straight down. These are way off from Forest Service grades. They're very steep. I think in 3 miles, we dropped close to 5,000 feet. Really steep descending. And we eventually got to the river basin, crossed a bridge that had it not been there, we probably would still be out there, because it was the only way across this raging river.
Yeah, you aren't going to swim that, are you?
No. And then this is looking back down to the river that we climbed out of. So if you look at the peak in the background, we'd started on the other side of that, climbed up near its shoulder, dropped to the river base, and then climbed this 6,000 foot climb back out of the river.
That's so spectacular.
Yes, just and it's just an amazing place to be. And we could be completely physically wrecked, but emotionally kind of buoyed up by the place we were in. This is a view looking towards our camp. So camp was at the toe of the lake. Here's another. Oh, we're at the campfire there. So Camp 4, this night felt a little bit different than the other nights. The reason being, we had lost 2 more runners at night halt 3 to altitude sickness. They ended up being evacuated by helicopter. So we were down. What is that? 6, 8. We ended up finishing with 8 of the international runners. So 12 dropped because of altitude related illness. This is Nikki Wren, one of the most badass women on the planet, multiple Tour de Géant finisher, Barkley runner, et cetera, et cetera. Her resume is super deep, and showing us pro tips on plastic bags around your wet shoes and hanging around the campfire. But this feel of this night felt pretty celebratory. We only had 25 more miles to go, and we'd get to the finish. And really the only way out was to the finish. We were a little bit lower elevation. We were at 14,000 this night, so it felt really good to be at low elevation for dinner. We got to eat well, and then have another great morning the next morning. This was another cool start. The Bhutanese runners again kind of hung out with us. We ran with them. That's 2 of them just ahead of me. Last 16,000 foot pass of the Snowman race here. This fine gentleman, who's the 2nd place finisher overall, fastest marathoner in Bhutan, he and I took a selfie at the top. He gave me a high five, and then he disappeared. He dropped off that pass so fast. Gabe and I then would run in the rest of the day, but we're looking towards where we're headed now, dropping down into this next big basin towards a community called Bhutan. Views along the way, still in the high mountains, some yak herders buildings in the background there. More mud. This actually might be a video if it plays here.
Here I can see the trail, but oh my gosh, that's
So lots of muddy miles this day. Um, this was a surprise checkpoint. This is when we entered or I guess it was the middle part of the national park. We'd come into the entrance earlier, but these are the national park rangers checking us in. They gave us some mango juice. And Gabe and I, who'd been alone since we'd left that first pass with Bhutanese runners, got caught by Waturo there in the middle. And then the three of us would run to the finish together. Um, Again, super rocky, muddy trails. Um, just tough footing, mostly descending this day. And then we had a final about 6 miles on the road at the end. Once we got down to the communities, this was just exceptional. I mentioned the school children before. Well, this is a much more populated area. None of the school children were in class. They were all out on the road. And you would go through a group of 150 school children and you'd run I don't know, 500 meters or 1,000 meters, and you'd hit another group and another group and another group. And that was like, it was all the way into town that way. We were beat up, we were tired, and we ran every step because of that support that we got. The finish line was an incredible celebration. It's one of the high commanders of the military greeting us, the director of tourism on the far left, the chairman of the race, and Luis Escobar, the race director, all there at the finish. And this finish line was like none I've experienced. And I've been to the big finishes. I've been to UTMB, I've been to Tour de Géance, Transvolcania. There were over 1,000 people here, and they were there for 19 runners that finished. They made us feel like superheroes. They had the most popular Bhutanese pop singer was performing, and they had booths on the scientific research that they were doing and sustainable goods they were producing. We got to spend a lot of time talking with school children who all speak incredible English. Their education's done 100% in English in Bhutan, and they're very articulate, asking thoughtful questions. It was just something else. Taklasan and I compared some sunburns from our high day, pretty crispy fried after being up at altitude in shorts, which is another thing that's pretty strange. I don't know, Scott, how many times have you been above 17,000 feet in shorts and a t-shirt?
No, I really can't think of a time when I've done that.
Some pretty joyous receptions. This is Nate Bender coming into the finish line. He whispered into my ear, that was the hardest thing I've ever done. And Nate's done some tough things. He's got the FKT on the 12ers in Montana, did this incredible link up in Glacier. Like, he is a tough mountain runner. And it humbled us all for sure. Photo of all the women that participated. Karma front and center, 30-year-old yak herder by profession, and won the race, beating out a contingent of some of the toughest female ultra runners in the world. And then there's the Bhutanese men, just incredible athletes. The second from the center on the left-hand side there, he's a former Bhutanese national boxing champion, also won several bronze medals in the Asian boxing championships. Found running about 3 years ago, got tired of getting punched, I guess, and turns out he's a heck of a runner. These guys I hope to see on some stages of some big international fields here in the future, because they could put the herd on. We had some great performances by the school children, some dancing, celebration. And then we shifted gears a little bit. So we finished this incredible endurance event. We got food. We did tree nurturing. So we went and we didn't plant trees, but we went and did some caring for trees that had been planted previously. This is me and the current Prime Minister of Bhutan. And we are getting dirty. We're pulling weeds, we're moving rocks, we're watering these plants and trees. And part of the discussion that occurred here is we all need to do this. This weight is not for one, it's for every, including someone like a prime minister. And to me, coming from the United States, I can't imagine pulling weeds with the president or the speaker of the house or any of our government officials. And yet that's what they're doing. And they invited us to be part of that. Then we went to the Bhutanese climate conclave. So that night, 6 runners were invited to speak, as well as many scientists, economists, and government officials about the climate challenges with Bhutan. Karma and I both got to represent and share some of the things we saw with the glacial lake Alsberg flood damage, the retreating glaciers, and the stories that we were told in the communities. So we shared those things, had this great educational evening learning about some of the work that Bhutan's doing and their plea to the rest of the world to join them in doing more work. The Prime Minister and I, once again, together, he individually gave us a certificate of completion, which was awesome, but not as awesome as this moment right here. This is October 20th. It's my son's birthday. I was calling him to wish him happy birthday. Prime Minister noticed I was on my phone and he came over and wished him happy birthday. And then he got the whole room to sing happy birthday to him.
Oh,
which
wow.
which is pretty
That's
cool. And
great.
again,
Yeah.
just a testament to the Bhutanese people are paying attention and they're caring. And again, what government official wants to sing happy birthday to an 8-year-old on the other side of the planet? Like, it just shows the depth of caring that they have. There's a photo not here, and the reason there's a photo not here is because we couldn't take a photo. But the next evening, probably the highlight of the trip for me was we got invited to a dinner, and we were told that we had to dress a certain way. It was back at the military headquarters. And as we were waiting for dinner to be served, His and Her Majesty, the King and Queen of Bhutan, showed up. And who meets a king, right? I mean, and we spent about 2 hours with their majesties, learning from them. They were so interested in our stories. They had been following all of our social media accounts and what we were sharing about the race. The king has trekked the Snowman trek 5 times. He's intimately familiar with that terrain. And he wanted to know about how the running went for each of us, what we were experiencing out there. And then he was challenging us to come back as messengers. And someone, I think it was one of the other runners, asked the king, said, "Why did you pick trail runners to come to Bhutan to talk about climate change?" And his answer was, I'll paraphrase because I couldn't write it down. I couldn't take a picture. I would have loved to video it, but he said, "Who better than a trail runner? They love nature and they need nature. They're the best messengers for this." And I don't disagree. I think that those of us who get the opportunity and have the need to spend time in wild places have a responsibility to share about the impacts that our current culture has on that. And I'm sure there'll be critiques. I took an airplane on the other side of the planet and I burned up a bunch of fossil fuel to get there. But what I feel like is that can be offset by the impact that we can make by telling this story and by inspiring other people to take action. And the combination of running and activism, I think, is one of the coolest things that I can do as an athlete. So I packed up my bags and came home, and now I'm here telling stories about it.
Nice. What an incredible experience, Luke. This is what a beautiful country and beautiful people.
Indeed. Last photo before we got on the airplane. This is just the international runners. We had to get up at 4 a.m., ride a bus for a couple hours before we got on the airplane to another 30 hours of air travel home. But I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to go and experience Bhutan. It's a country that up until the 70s didn't allow external visitors. There wasn't tourism, and even now tourism is still quite limited. And we were guests, and the royal carpet was rolled out for us, and we had an experience that I don't think many others will have that opportunity. But the Snowman race is something that they plan on holding every other year. So if this is something that's interesting to you, keep your eyes peeled because there may be opportunity in the future.
Wow, what a trip, huh?
Yeah.
I know you've been on a lot of amazing trips to incredible places, but it sounds like this one was right at the top of the list.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in so many levels, I would say, as far as running events that I've done, this rates in probably the top three of the toughest running events that I've done. And I don't think those would be a one, two, three. I think it's three tied for the toughest. The altitude on this was just wholly next level. Uh, the cultural experience was the most impactful of my life. The religious experience, I'm not Buddhist, but the teachings and the experience that we had there uh, was life changing.
Yeah.
Amazing things you can bring back from other parts of the world, for sure.
For sure. Yeah. I've often said, and I certainly have held this feeling for much of my adult life. Ever as a young person, I did travel to third world countries as with my parents quite a bit. But I think it's something that most, certainly us in America, and I think most of the people in the West don't have enough exposure to see how most of the people in the world actually live. We live in our little bubbles here, and it's hard to relate. And until you see like those, school children living in that incredibly inhospitable terrain, but thriving there, they're happy, they're having great lives. And I think it's a eye-opening thing for people in the West who, we have such easily materially easy lives that it's just hard for us to understand that. And I remember my very first trip to the Karakoram in Pakistan, and I mean those have to be some of the poorest people in the world, the Baltis, living where they do. And with the I think that when I was there the first time, that the for all of Pakistan, the per capita income was about $250. And up in Baltistan, I'm sure it wasn't even half of that. But I just remember the experience with some of the porters who had all of their belongings on their body attached to them at one place or another. They were either wearing it or carrying it. And but they were so they were certainly the poorest people I had ever been around, and yet they had to also be some of the happiest people I'd ever been around. And they would they were so happy with an 8x8 piece of plastic to sleep under. We were obliged by the government to bring certain things. I'm sure you've been seeing this kind of thing and on other expeditions where we had to provide sunglasses and shoes and this piece of plastic and of course they didn't wear the sunglasses or the shoes so they could sell them at the end of the trip. But you'd see 50 guys huddled under a bunch of plastic tarps, all smoking and singing all night long, just having the great old time. And it was really a pretty moving experience for me, and then to engage with them where they again, being so materially poor, I think they find their wealth sort of spiritually, because they don't have that option. We have, again, this easy materialism that makes it hard in many cases to find the spiritual meanings of life. But they don't have that option. And I was just very impressed with that type of behavior and just that cultural experience for me, which it was nothing as ornate and beautiful as what you've seen here. I mean, these people live in, they live basically the same as their animals. Their domesticated animals live about as well as they do. But it was, I'm sure, a similar experience for you to come away with this and realize, oh, these people have a different way of dealing with life than most of us over here do.
Absolutely. And Bhutan is unique in the fact that they measure their gross domestic product in happiness, right? And their whole mindset to wealth or materialism it's different. And like you're saying, they are some of the happiest and most caring people that I've ever been around. Um,
Mm.
Full stop. And they don't have the luxurious life that we have in the West. Um, and I think they're better for it, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not that the Bhutanese, they live well, they're not in squalor, they're happy. and they take care of each other and care for each other in ways that had not experienced before. So it was just outstanding, and hopefully something I can apply to my life a little bit better.
Yeah, I think whenever, I think it wears off, or at least it has on me. I think every now and then it's like we need a booster shot of third world,
Yeah,
to kind of have a little more gratitude for what we have, but also an understanding that, our Western worldview and especially the materialism that goes along with it, which I'm, fully capable of exploiting maximally myself.
sure.
I'm I'm as materialistic as the next person, but to just have it put in your face that, oh yeah, there's another way. There's another way to live.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely,
Yeah.
and I completely agree. I think there are those of us who have wandering souls that need this, and then we have a
Mhm.
responsibility to share, because not
Yeah.
everyone will get the opportunity or the privilege to go to a place like Bhutan or Pakistan or Nepal, and so it's a responsibility that I don't take lightly. I love being able to share about this, and hopefully it can inspire people to do great things in their own lives.
Well, it's certainly a spectacular country. Now tell me, because it's inspiring to me, and I'm sure other people who see these pictures. So you say tourism is still somewhat restricted there, or how does,
It is.
in what way? The
So
number
the
of
way that
visas, or
Yeah, the way that it's interesting how Bhutan has approached this, and I don't know the deep intricacies because we were guests, and so I didn't have to go through this process. But the way that I understand it is there are a limited number of visas, and then there is a visa fee, and it was recently adjusted, and it's expensive. It's $200 a day for your visa. That money from His Majesty himself, that goes directly back into the tourism industry. That goes to training guides. It goes to training the porters. It goes to the infrastructure, the schools that's associated with that. Um, so it's a responsible approach to it. And the way it was described to me by one of the officials was they don't want tourism to be extractive. They don't want it to be another extractive industry. They want it to be a growth and kind of mutual compassion industry, and so they're not letting it get out of hand. Um, that they wanted to
that
keep
looks
it
like a beautiful
relatively under
hotel,
control.
and I assume that's a hotel you're
This is actually
standing
the
in front of.
airport. Yeah,
Oh,
this
that's
is the
it's
airport.
the airport.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. All and the hotels are beautiful. The restaurants are beautiful. The food is delicious. It's spicy, but man, it's good. And there are ways for people to experience the trail that we were on. The Snowman Trek is one of those. Um, it is known that the Snowman Trek has been completed by fewer people than have climbed Mount Everest, so it's tough, and it's a big commitment. They also have just opened a really fascinating trail called the Trans Bhutan Trail, crosses the entire country. Um, and Bhutan's
Wow.
really a varied country. It's a small country, but it shares a southern border with India in the jungle, and there's elephants and Bengal tigers and all of those jungly things. And then the northern border shared with China on the Tibet side and into the Himalayas. And then that trail transverses from west to east or east to west, through many of those different
Wow.
ecosystems, and um, definitely things that people should put it on your bucket list.
Yeah.
Maybe scratch a few other things off and put that at the top, and get there. Go
Yeah.
experience Bhutan.
It certainly looks like it's a worthwhile destination. Oh,
Yeah,
wow. Well, thank you. I really thank you for sharing this with us. What an experience. So unique. And um, yeah, it's inspiring, really inspiring on all levels, both from the awareness standpoint, obviously the physical challenge standpoint. Is it something did you think you would go back to?
no question. Yeah,
Hmm.
no hesitation. I would absolutely go back, in any capacity that I could. And I hope that through the efforts of sharing about the important things about it, that I could earn a spot back if there's an opportunity, for sure.
Wow. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed that. And those of you that have only been able to listen to this, I hope you'll make the effort to go to our YouTube channel. This is evokeendurance.com. We do have a YouTube channel, and as everyone knows, we're kind of in our infancy here, getting started, but this will be well worth your time to watch this. I think people will be enthralled by it. I mean, it's spectacular scenery, incredible story, and a great storyteller. So thanks so much, Luke. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. It's been an honor.
Well, I'm sure we'll be talking again soon. So take care,
Yes,
everybody,
sir.
until our next Evoke cast.